Church is hard. Church is hard for the person walking through the doors afraid of judgment. Church is hard for the pastor's family under the microscope of an entire body. Church is hard for the prodigal soul returning home, broken and battered by the world. Church is hard for the girl who looks like she has it all together but doesn't. Church is hard for the couple who fought the entire ride to service. Church is hard for the single mom surrounded by couples holding hands and seemingly perfect families. Church is hard for the widow and widower with no invitation to lunch after service. Church is hard for the deacon with an estranged child. Church is hard for the person singing worship songs, overwhelmed by the weight of the lyrics. Church is hard for the man insecure in his role as a leader. Church is hard for the wife who longs to be led by a righteous man. Church is hard for the nursery volunteer who desperately longs for a baby to love. Church is hard for the single woman and single man praying God brings them a mate. Church is hard for the teenage girl wearing a scarlet letter, ashamed of her mistakes. Church is hard for sinners. Church is hard for me. It's hard because on the outside, it's all looks shiny and perfect, Sabbath best in behavior and dress. However, underneath those layers, you find a body of imperfect people, carnal souls, and selfish motives. That was written by Jacob Waldron. And I'm sure every one of you can relate it with at least one of those lines in there. But after I read through that, I've had this for a few years. It was, I think, back in 21 that I actually found this. And after reading through it, you get the question, why is church so hard? If we're going to answer that question, we first need to define what is church. And so we're going to dig into the dictionary really quick this morning, look at a couple words, and we're going to start with just the basic definition of the word church. Going to a Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition given: a body or organization of religious believers, such as the whole body of Christians. Now, that is actually the third definition that they list. However, I'm pretty sure church is not hard because of the building. We have a wonderful building here. The first definition is a building, but that's not going to answer the question for us this morning. So I like that definition they gave there, but we throw that word in there of Christian. How do we define Christian? Lots of definitions out there, but we're going to stay in the dictionary this morning. And Christian is defined as one who professes belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Well, what does profess mean? Once again, going to the dictionary, to confess one's faith in or allegiance to. Now, you can keep going down the rabbit hole of definitions at this point. If you look up confess, which I did for the fun of it, it actually points back to profess. So you get trapped in this infinite circle of definitions there. So we're going to stop there. So we've got a body or organization of religious believers, such as the whole body of Christians. And then we had one who professes belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ. And then to confess one's faith in or allegiance to. So I kind of put all those together and came up with my own definition of what is church. a group of people who have faith in Jesus Christ. Now, I'm sure you can poke holes in that definition. I'm sure we could continue to improve upon it, but we're not trying to rewrite the dictionary this morning. We're just working to answer the question of why church is hard. And if we're people that have faith in Jesus Christ, we need to look at Jesus Christ for our answers. And so this morning, as we dig into the Bible, we're going to look at 4 stories, starting in the Old Testament and ending in the New Testament, of different scenarios where people had problems. We're going to start this morning with Exodus, where we find a leader who isn't feeling ready for the task he's been called to do. Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 through 17. Now, this is just a part of a much greater story. And if you need a refresher on that, your assignment this afternoon is to read the full story of all the stories we're going to go through this morning. Exodus 4, verses 10 through 17. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I'm slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and teach you what to say." But Moses says, "Pardon your servant. Lord, please send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you. He will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak, and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hands so you can perform the signs with it." Moses was trying to back out. "I don't want to do it. You want me to go, but I am not the person for you." He was trying to put his foot down. And if you catch that at verse 14, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. The Lord was getting frustrated. Said, "I called you. I've prepared you for this. I've done all this stuff. I need you to go, and you're putting your foot down and causing problems." He was arguing with God. God got frustrated. And God said, "I got your back. I can take care of it." How many times have we found ourselves in those situations where it's not what we want to do? Let's jump over to our next story in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Starting in verse 8. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 8, going all the way through verse 18. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Once they were finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow saying, "Lord Almighty, if you look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him." So she said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went on her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Now we know the ending of that story. But in that moment, Hannah was so desperate for a child, the priest of all people thought she was drunk. Have you ever been so desperate for something that you would be willing to pray from that great anguish, unafraid of who would see you and what they may think? That's what happened. She was so desperate for it. She was praying, not caring in the moment what those around her would think. Today, it would be the pastor of your local church that says, "Are you drunk?" How would that go over for you if the pastor sees you and asks you, "Are you drunk?" In both of these stories, if Moses or Hannah would have fallen victim to the human tendency of self-doubt, let those fears creep into their lives, how would these stories have ended? If Hannah was afraid of what others may think, would she have ever actually prayed that prayer? Would she have been willing to lay it all on the line? Would Samuel have ever been born? If Moses was so scared that he didn't want to speak and walked away from God, we wouldn't have 5 books that start the Bible written by Moses. Let's continue on with our stories this morning. We're going to move into the New Testament now in Luke. Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. We find a parable here that Jesus told. Luke 15, 11 through 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out a citizen of that country, who set him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick! Bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found." And so they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And when he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied. "Your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you, never disobeying your orders. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Our sinful human mindset has a whole lot different outcome to that story. You got your share. You made your choices. Tough luck. I already gave you what's due to you. You want more? You're going to work. You're going to start at the bottom, work up. That's what we say. I am so glad that Jesus says, "I forgive you," and throws a party. Because if we had to work every time we screwed up, we would all be lost. Jesus is different. You have to get away from that human mindset. We're going to go to one more story. John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. John 8, verses 2 through 11. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him. He sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. And here's the difference. But Jesus bent down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to him, "Let anyone who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left. With the woman still standing there, Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." The Pharisees were 100% correct. In the law given to the Israelites through Moses, she should have been stoned. That's what the law said. They were correct. But you see that difference in Jesus' character come out at that moment. You see the love in the forgiveness. We all fall into the trap of trying to point out who is the best, who is the worst. We try to point out other people's problems so that we make ourselves look better. Yet in Romans 3:23, we find that for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Jesus said at the end of that story, "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." Jesus is calling us back to him. He does not condemn us, but instead says, leave the sin behind and follow. We have seen Jesus through the Bible. We have seen Jesus in our own lives. We've seen Jesus in the lives of others, and yet we still do not believe. We let our fear take over our lives, and we make church hard. John 6:36, our scripture reading from the Passion Translation. "Yet I've told you that even though you've seen me, you still don't believe me." I started the message today with a piece written by Jacob Waldron. When I read it, I left out the most important part, the last half of it. So as I close this message this morning, I'm going to read the entirety of it for you, starting at the beginning again. And listen closely as it wraps up. Church is hard. Church is hard for the person walking through the doors afraid of judgment. Church is hard for the pastor's family under the microscope of an entire body. Church is hard for the prodigal soul returning home broken and battered by the world. Church is hard for the girl who looks like she has it all together but doesn't. Church is hard for the couple who fought the entire ride to service. Church is hard for the single mom surrounded by couples holding hands and seemingly perfect families. Church is hard for the widow and widower with no invitation to lunch after service. Church is hard for the deacon with an estranged child. Church is hard for the person singing worship songs, overwhelmed by the weight of the lyrics. Church is hard for the man insecure in his role as a leader. Church is hard for the wife who longs to be led by a righteous man. Church is hard for the nursery volunteer who desperately longs for a baby to love. Church is hard for the single woman and single man praying God brings them a mate. Church is hard for the teenage girl wearing a scarlet letter, ashamed of her mistakes. Church is hard for the sinners Church is hard for me. It's hard because on the outside, it all looks shiny and perfect, Sabbath best in behavior and dress. However, underneath those layers, you find a body of imperfect people, carnal souls, and selfish motives. But here is the beauty of church. Church isn't a building mentality or expectation. Church is a body. Church is a group of sinners saved by grace, living in fellowship as saints. Church is a body of believers bound as brothers and sisters by an eternal love. Church is a holy ground where sinners stand as equals before the throne of grace. Church is a refuge for broken hearts and a training ground for mighty warriors. Church is a converging of confrontation and invitation, where sin is confronted and hearts are invited to seek restoration. Church is a lesson in faith and trust. Church is a bearer of burdens and a giver of hope. Church is a family coming together, setting aside differences, forgetting past mistakes, rejoicing in the smallest of victories. Church, the body, the circle of sinners turned saints, is where he resides. And if we ask, he is faithful to come. So even on the hardest days at church, the days when I'm at odds with my friends, when I've fought with my spouse because we're late once again, when I've walked in bearing burdens heavier than my heart can handle, yet masking the pain with a smile on my face, when I've worn a scarlet letter under the microscope, when I've longed for a baby to hold or fought tears as the lyrics were sung, when I've walked back in afraid and broken after walking away, I'll remember, he has never failed to meet me here.